Okay, let's dive straight in. I've said we're going to tackle some of the basics. So net zero, Helena, what does net zero mean?
Yeah, so I think the focus on net zero is around the net. So it's recognising that in the way that we operate and live our lives, we are always going to be using some form of carbon and always have been. But the carbon that we release needs to be equal to the carbon that the environment's able to absorb around us, whether that's through trees and plants or into the ocean. And the collective, one offsetting the other, achieves net zero. But we do cheat and use net zero carbon as a shorthand for other greenhouse gases. So, we also need to factor in methane and refrigerant gases and so on into that overarching balancing equation.
Emma, would you agree? Is that a good summary?
I think that's an amazing summary, but also to the general public, quite technical summary. So, I like to bring it back to earth in terms a little bit, in terms of taking you back to 1990, time of Nessun Dorma, Vogue by Madonna, a seminal piece by Vanilla Ice, Ice Baby, and the box office hit Home Alone. So that's 1990, right?
Okay.
Most people listening probably can remember one of those things and, picture where they are.
I can see this podcast going off on a tangent now.
Yeah, I was about 12, right?
Yeah.
But we've got to get our emissions down to 68% of those levels. And, that was before I could drive. That's before I went on a plane. You think about your lifestyle now versus then. It's a fairly big ask of people to take themselves effectively back in time to lower levels.
And so when we're looking at net zero, it's really about ensuring we're not tipping the balance. We're not putting more in than we're taking out. Because I think often, and we mentioned before, Helena, that the confusion, I think that people talk about net zero and they talk about zero emissions in the same sentence, but actually the two are very different.
They are, and we're never going to achieve zero emissions. And I think it's a bit disheartening if people try to. So if we focus on the built environment, then we can largely split emissions into two areas. There's the embodied carbon, which comes through the construction process of new buildings. And then there's the operational carbon associated with how we use those buildings, which typically is over a 50 to 80 year lifespan. And a significant proportion of the carbon associated with the building is from that upfront embodied carbon. And that is an element which is really hard to reduce. There's a lot of, government policy at the moment around how do we generate more low carbon steel, low carbon concrete, low carbon glass, which is dependent on really large infrastructure solutions to enable us to reduce the carbon in association. And there are lower carbon building materials available, but not at a mass scale that we need to really drive that change. Having said that, here in the UK, most of the buildings that we need in 2050 are already built. So actually, our embodied carbon footprint doesn't need to be that great as a nation. And therefore, a lot of the focus is spent on operational carbon, i.e. the carbon that we're using within those buildings. And that's why we have a large focus around demand reduction in the operational phase and also a transition to electrification. So historically in the UK, we heat our buildings largely with gas, sometimes with oil when we're off the gas network. And there is a high carbon element within both of those fuels. And so as we're progressing to a lower carbon future, we're switching to electrification solutions largely, whereby we are able to reduce the carbon factor in our electrical grid. Again, that is a major infrastructure project currently going on, but that we should by 2030 have 50% of we call it the carbon factor in our electrical grid that we had a year ago.
Okay, so what's embodied carbon and what's operational carbon?
So embodied carbon is the carbon that we expend in the construction phase, and operational carbon is the carbon that we expend whilst we're using the building through the gas and electricity from living within the building.
This is great. I get to ask all the questions I've been meaning to ask for years, but under the pretense of a podcast. Emma, what does net zero mean for you in the work that you're doing?
So we have some quite difficult conversations with people because actually, we're going through a bit of a cost of living crisis, energy crisis. There are people living in some pretty mouldy, damp kind of homes. So to try and explain this to people, sometimes, it could be about improving people's lives in order to get to net zero. But at the same time, it's how do we make buildings work harder effectively? So consuming less, as Helena said, but also maybe generating more. And that's something we've spent a lot of time focusing on. So we have this amazing database called Kraken. It's like a beast. Greg Jackson describes it as a computer. So we have this computer that's balancing the grid all the time. And we think using the flexibility of when people consume power and when they generate power, that's where we can get people to net zero. So effectively, they consume, or the property they live in consumes less than what they actually generate. And that's where we can get that offset. So, some clever technology with some green technology on homes, we think we can help push homes to become closer to net zero.
Okay. And I'm going to come back to you in a minute on the homes and sort of domestic setting, what we can do. But Helena, we're sat here today in London. How on earth do you start to tackle this challenge, looking at it as a city?
Yeah, it's a big challenge and one that a lot of people are grappling with at the moment. But if you look at city scale solutions, you have to look at the fact that actually buildings aren't the only element, which is shifting to electrification. And we've got a major shift in transport solutions to electrification as well. And so, to refer to Emma's comment around how do we manage the demand, we need to integrate that shift in demand between the built environment and our transport demands. One of the ways in which we're doing that in the UK is with a big focus in urban areas around heat networks. So the government has commissioned work for the biggest 130 towns and cities within the UK to identify where there are areas where it makes sense to introduce a heat network, which is essentially a zone whereby low carbon heat is generated from a variety of sources. Often they are either waste heat from data centers, which we're seeing increasingly at the moment, or extracting heat from sewer source is really popular at the moment, or waste heat from manufacturing processes, or simply extracting heat from large bodies of water, including aquifers, or sometimes just large-scale air source heat pumps. And one of the great advantages of that is that you can have a single energy centre or a number of energy centres. You don't have to have individual plant in individual buildings, and you get great diversity of supply. To go back to the domestic example around actually being able to support people in controlling their their load demand. When you're looking at building heating, we see really different load demand between commercial setting buildings and residential setting buildings. And actually, therefore, you can really reduce the overall capacity requirement by using a heat network and enabling that heat to be distributed across that broader, diverse set of buildings.
So it's about using heat that would be otherwise wasted. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, fundamentally, it's where we're using data centers particularly. And I love that example because we've got great growth in data centers at the moment, almost anywhere, but certainly in adjacent to urban areas. And so there's a project that AECOM's providing the technical support on at the moment in West London, whereby there are new data centres going to provide 97% of the heat to a new heat network, which will support 20,000 residential units and a hospital. So, it's amazing in terms of the community impact, and it's taking the waste heat from the data centre is otherwise literally waste. Mm-hmm. So there's no downside really to that sort of solution. Other networks where are often using heat pumps to extract that heat, and therefore there is still significant electricity input to enable that heat generation, but at a much lower rate than if we were providing any other form of heating solution.
And how does that cross over into Octopus's world?
Well, personally, it crosses into personal world. As our villages run now, 64 of the homes are connected to a district heating scheme. So we've got 108 boreholes, we've got an industrial air source, and we have a private wire to a solar farm off-site. So we're pretty close to net zero.
And let's just rewind a little bit, because you've got quite an important part to play in your domestic.
A part to play. None of these projects can be delivered just on their own with one single person. But yeah, it was a gem of an idea. Take the village off oil, and district heating seems the obvious way forward. The trouble is in urban areas, rural areas, is it's much more expensive. We've got 250 home potential on a network of 7.5 kilometres. And you take Helena's example, you can have thousands of houses or homes, flats, etc. connected. So we see it as a rural solution as well. It's a lot more expensive than in urban areas. But that's not the day job. The day job is actually also talking to all sorts of communities about how can we reduce, their running costs, but also be part of the green transition as well. And so, getting to net zero is challenging for homes, and we're working very hard looking at things like air source heat pumps, solar, battery, and then with our ECO4 requirements on as a provider of power in the UK. We're working really hard to retrofit those on the lowest incomes, doing full house retrofits to bring their EPCs up. So, there's a lot of things going on, and there's not one solution that fits all. But I think definitely taking homes to heat is definitely something that the planners should be considering. And I think...
Sorry, homes to heat.
Well, where there's a heat source, we should actually think that's where homes should go. So literally taking homes to where heat is being produced, which maybe is not something we've thought about before in urban planning terms.
And because gas is so cheap, it doesn't really drive urban planning in terms of thinking about how we will heat our homes and other buildings. But due to the war in Ukraine and the focus across Europe on energy resilience, as well as the journey to net zero, it really has changed the landscape around policy for future heating solutions.
And we also think that power generation is going to start influencing planning policy as well. So you've got lots of wind turbines up in Scotland, for example. Actually, that's where we should be having some industrial growth and actually putting things that need power nearby so we can utilise it. Having wind turbines up in Scotland and on the whole a greater need for power down in the south, it doesn't really work. So actually we need to think about localised generation in the south, more maybe onshore wind, more solar, and then also look at what industries should be going up to where the power is being produced. So a shift in sort of planning, really, a bit more like early settlers looked at settlements. They wanted water supply, they wanted defence, they wanted high land so they could see their enemies coming. We need to think a little bit more around what are the assets we've got and how could we use them more.
I'm convinced. But how do we convince the communities that we need to bring these changes to? And both in looking where we are today in East London, but equally in a rural environment, how do we get people to come with us?
So we've got a really cool thing called the Fan Club. So currently at Octopus, we've got 4 wind turbines. One is offshore. And if you live in a postcode area near those wind turbines, you can watch the wind turbine, and every half an hour you can see how that wind turbine's performing. And also, if it's going round, you get 20% off your electricity bill. But if it's really going round, you get 50% off your energy bill. And we love the fact that our customers can interact with this technology as well. So we know that there is desperately more demand. We've got Gusty Spinfield, who was powering the food area last year at Glastonbury, named by our customers, by the way. And Gusty goes on tour during the year. And so therefore, more people are seeing a wind turbine, understanding it, thinking, hey, I want one of these in my community, and then I can see the benefits. So we are trying very hard to show people the benefits of this technology rather than running away from it. Just, come and embrace it. And we've got an amazing innovation centre in Slough. So we've got a house built to 50s building regs and a house built to 90s building regs. Not only are we actually training over 1,000 engineers a year through there, but we're also bringing in different communities, councillors, planners, to have a look at this technology, listen to the air source heat pumps. They're not noisy like people think. Have a look at what the solar panels are like on the roof and really help with that education piece.
I think I just spent all the time looking at the turbine out the window, just going, monitoring it. Helena, similar question around communities, but in a city environment, because I would suggest, a more complex and lots of communities living together. How do you ensure that, or how do you bring them along the journey? If a heat network is brought in, how much do people actually know that it's coming in and see the benefits, understand the benefits?
It's a really good question. And generally speaking, the answer that we rely upon is policy. And, there are a lot of changes at the moment in policy within the UK, particularly around heat networks, and significant changes likely to come into force next year around the adoption of heat networks, so that the default is that you will join the heat network, as opposed to at the moment whereby the default is that you don't. But there is a big challenge with hearts and minds. Our home is our castle, very much so in the UK culture. And so there's a massive education piece. And actually, I find that some of the best questions I get asked are by young people. And, they are being educated about the importance of a sustainable planet, of looking after our natural resources. So both from my own children, I get significant challenge, but, equally as, I see the apprentices and graduates coming into AECOM. At AECOM, we have sustainable legacies commitments and very committed towards creating sustainable communities. And yet there's always further that we can go. And I love it when, the young people coming into the office challenged as to, actually, is there more that we can do? So I think, there is that culture shift coming, but there is still very much a generational divide in the understanding around technologies.
Yeah, it does need to be simple for a lot of people still. It could be smart technology, but you don't need to be super smart to operate it. Yeah. And I think the easier we make it, the better. It's very much the focus of our zero bills proposition, is that actually we can work with developers, we can put technology onto the home, but actually the homeowner just moves in and sets the dial on the thermostat. We control the rest of the technology through the smart meter. I mean, it's particularly good for housing associations with vulnerable customers. They've got enough going on in their lives. They don't need to work out how to optimize their batteries and their solar panels and the air source. They can just move in, live their life as they want. But we optimize all of the technology to make sure that the house is warm and cozy when they need it. But at the same time, we're utilizing their house as an energy generator or an energy storage center, and using the flexibility of the house in order to ensure that they don't actually get charged a bill.
And what about the challenges around housing stock buildings, older stock versus the new builds, both in a city and in a more domestic setting? Can we retrofit every building? What are the challenges?
To achieve our net zero commitments, we have to. So, and there's very good reasons for doing so. I mean, Emma's touched on some of the social challenges in association with the very poor quality of our building stock, and embarrassed to say that across Europe, the UK has one of the worst social housing quality of any country. And so we need to invest in improving it. And one of the ways in which we really improve the health outcomes for the residents is by improving the insulation and the thermal performance of those buildings, eliminating the mold problems that there are within them. And there is a whole variety of solutions as to how we do that. So there is lots of grant funding available to support these transitions, whether it's the Homes Upgrade Grant, whether it's the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, whether it's the spending of the ECO4 funding. All of those are sort of individual home style solutions based on a mix of technologies, supporting ensuring that we're not pushing people into fuel poverty due to the additional cost in association with different heating solutions. But then there's also district-wide areas solutions around sort of wrapping homes, for want of a better term, whereby organisations come in and offer a street-by-street solution, whereby you literally put a new facade across a whole street, and achieve that insignificant thermal improvement in a really rapid implementation. And I think the truth is that it will be a combination of all of these things that support us through the transition. But the scale of the challenge is phenomenal. We have a large population in the UK, and all of us live in a home. And most of those homes are really energy inefficient. So the retrofit challenge is something like 1 every 3 seconds that we need to deliver between now and 2050. And we haven't been delivering that to date. So we really need to wrap up the rate at which we are delivering this retrofit.
And I don't think it should be underestimated the high level anxiety this brings to people. Mm-hmm. You can get really swamped with the technologies, what's right for your home, what technology should I adopt first. And actually that's really where district heating schemes do come in quite well, because actually once you've sorted out the heating and the hot water, you kind of know you can live in your house. It sort of takes that anxiety away. And then you can think, right, I now need to think about loft insulation, wall insulation. Maybe I'd think about some batteries and some solar. But it's a really hard mindset. One of the interesting things we found is we do a lot of salary sacrifice electric vehicle schemes. And for a lot of people, an electric vehicle tends to be that first step into understanding all about flexibility. So we've got some great tariffs that sit alongside all the different technologies. But, the ability to charge your car at 7.5 pence a kilowatt hour versus 31 pence during the day, people then start to understand, actually, if I can flex when I need power, or if I could store power until I need it when it's expensive on the grid, then we can start unlocking this system. But it's a pretty tough gig, to sell to people. And I looked at my mum, and, just trying to encourage her to get a smart meter was quite challenging. So, but we've got to somehow bring everybody along together, that this is the mood music and this is where we're going. But I think we need to debunk some of the myths. I think we need to talk in more common English, to people about these things.
Yeah.
And I think once your neighbour starts doing something, it'll have that sort of rolling effect that, that street's doing that. Why are they doing that? Would I like that? Oh, their bills are cheaper. I might like that as well. To me, it sort of
surely there comes a point where it's people seeing the benefits.
Precisely. Yeah.
Everybody probably I hope that everybody thinks, right, this is a good thing, we should all be doing this. But until you can actually see the tangible benefit, it's quite difficult to don't make that first step, perhaps.
It's a really tough gig. This is the first time, other than maybe COVID, where everybody has actually got to do something collectively together. It's a big ask. It's a huge ask, isn't it? But we've all got to look at our situation and think, what could I do, even if it's a small thing, to help?
And one of the key challenges is, who do people trust? So, the case around solar is now really very clear. There's a very short return on investment from a financial perspective, and there is a very short return on investment from the carbon, going back to the embodied and operational carbon question. And yet people don't put them on their homes. We've had a significant uptick in the UK, but there is nothing like the demand that there should be if you look at it through an accounting lens. And that's because people don't trust the advice they hear, because there's always a doom-monger story that somebody had it and that it didn't connect properly, and with the systems in their house, or they had to have their tiles replaced underneath it, or whatever it might be, and therefore that has a really big knock-on effect. Equally, people find it hard to choose to make the investment if they don't know whether they're going to stay in the home. It's not very clear at the moment that it adds value, albeit that there is data that shows it, but we don't publish that data in a way that it's accessible to the general public. So I think, the hearts and minds winning is at least as big a challenge as the technology challenges.
But I do think the money markets help, in terms of money always seemingly makes the world go round at the end. And for definite, the banks are now looking towards helping their customers improve their homes. We've had the Paris Climate Change Agreement signed last year. Big corporations had to show their carbon footprint. And so therefore, there is now an expectation that footprint reduces year on year. So the banks are very focused in helping customers improve their homes and take them on that journey to maybe take them from a low EPC to a higher EPC. So I think we'll see the messaging coming through in different ways into people's lives. And when that's more aligned, I think that's when you get more clarity of movement. When, everybody's talking about it, your children are talking about it, your mortgage company's talking about it, somebody on the radio's talking about it. I think we need that mass movement and I think it's coming.
I think in the commercial sector, banks again are driving it, but because so many of the banks now, made voluntary commitments, now they've got mandatory disclosures, we're seeing huge drivers around commercial real estate to improve their carbon performance. And there's some simplistic measurement tools which are used broadly in the industry, which really demonstrate whether assets are in line or not to be compliant with Paris Agreement targets. And we are starting to see real asset value impact, whereby a building is no longer compliant with the trajectory. It's part of most technical due diligence exercises now. So when an organisation is looking to purchase a commercial building, then that assessment is a basic requirement of the acquisition process. And all of those things come together to drive real change in the commercial property market. And we need to take that momentum and apply it in other sectors.
And also the skills, if we can train people up on the commercial markets that are leading ahead, we need all these people that have the ability to install this technology. So, it's just getting people through the training and actually, out there installing and making sure they're armed with the right knowledge, so we don't go and make stupid mistakes like spray foam of the past. We've got to make sure each property is assessed to make sure it's right for that property, for whatever construction or whatever it is. It's a big job. And with another hat on, the RICS are taking this very seriously. And having just taken over being chair of the residential forum, it's something we know we need to start upskilling very quickly surveyors to be able to go out and give this advice to people. Because back to Helena's point, who do you trust to give you this advice to make sure it's right for your property? And hindsight will always be a wonderful thing. So we just got to do the very best we can do now, noting there may be new technologies, new products coming forward, but it shouldn't stop you from acting now, thinking there might be something better down the line.
We talked about individual conversations about, okay, I'm going to retrofit my home, I'm going to bring in a heat pump, which I'm going to come back to in a minute and ask you what a heat pump is and how it works, I promise. What about council leaders, community leaders? The conversations that you're having, are they all on side? Do they all get it? Careful what you say here, but do they? And if they don't, how do we ensure that they start to see the benefits for the communities they lead?
Yeah, I think council leaders are in a difficult situation at the moment. So yes, nearly all councils within the UK have declared climate emergency, made carbon reduction commitments. However, we also are very aware that, all councils are really budget constrained at the moment, and ever increasingly so. And so we're doing a lot of work with those council leaders to find ways in which we can support them on their decarbonisation pathway, whereby their contribution is bringing stakeholder buy-in, also bringing their assets along, but actually not the financial contributions. And we're finding that that's much more successful in terms of building momentum in the local areas. There is challenge around building trust with private sector finance. I think, all local authorities recognise that it's necessary, but at the moment it feels a bit like a necessary evil. There's a lot of scars left from PFI days of old, and fears around whether or not you can actually achieve value for money. But with bringing some more transparent procurement processes to enable that to happen, we've supported them in moving a long way forwards. And, heat networks are a great example. So the way in which funding's evaluated now for heat networks is that the government will provide grants through the Green Heat Fund to create an investable project for the development of a heat network. So generally speaking, the vast majority of the funding's coming from the private sector with some grant support. But actually, we can't deliver those networks without the public sector local authority support, partly because it's their buildings which are committing to taking the heat to which the network's generating, but partly because they can bring the broader stakeholder engagement around the local community and embrace the implementation of a heat network. They are disruptive things. We have to dig up pavements to install a heat network. That's not great from the perspective of the public. If their home's not benefiting from the future green heat, actually, what's in it for them? And so typically we're seeing much broader schemes, which are including things like potentially smart grids at the same time, whereby there's an electric grid. Because of the challenges around the national grid capacity, we're seeing smaller grids being installed with generation on local roofs, EV charging networks being installed on the local streets, and that's all being installed whilst we've got the pavements dug up for the heat network. And then equally, when we're putting the roads back, potentially putting in cycle lanes to enable that active travel modal shift, and an overarching transition is being enabled through the one infrastructure project. It enables so much more.
So surely there's a huge opportunity here. Your point about skills. Surely this drive is a great opportunity to invest in skills, to invest in jobs, to get money into the economy and get things going. So we should be looking at this in quite a positive way, shouldn't we? As well as all of the benefits in terms of reducing our emissions.
I mean, we see it at Octopus in a very positive way. We totally recognise our place in terms of the education piece, but also actually encouraging people to come into the industry. And the joy of the energy industry that we're in is there's almost a place for everybody. There's skill sets that are needed across the board. We need data scientists through to men and women who are out there talking to our customers, making sure they're on the right tariff, through to installing technology. This is literally a team effort to help people through what we've got to go through. But the long, the short of it is it does take time to train people up to install air source heat pumps, climb on roofs, put on solar, know where to put batteries. It's not a quick thing. So yes, we're gearing up, but I think everybody needs to be gearing up and encouraging people that, maybe they would consider an apprenticeship or, come through. Because to be honest, we've been taking a lot of people who maybe been in the gas industry and bringing them into the electrification world. We need to keep feeding the pipeline of people coming through. And it's something we're very conscious and aware of. But we also need to look at the funding streams as well. Sometimes funding has been for some of the right stuff, but on other occasions, there's been some missed opportunities. So, for example, housing associations in Wales have been installing solar and batteries because their funding enabled them to do that, whereas in England, it's just been solar. But actually, if you can understand tariffs and the whole flexibility, actually, to have that battery as well is amazing with the solar. So it's sort of an education piece as well for decision makers as to how they're allocating their funding, be it at council level, be it at national level. What's going to make the most difference? What has the lowest carbon impact? What's going to see the best results? And sometimes not all of those things align, but it's making sure that everybody comes together forward at the same time.
I think one point I wanted to add to that is the local jobs. So one of the great things for local authorities is that particularly the insulation work across buildings, almost every region has people who are able to deliver that locally and therefore support the local socioeconomic development through the implementation of those projects. And I think, it's really important from a calm perspective as well as that's economic development perspective, wherever it's possible to use those local resources to deliver the projects.
And it's trusted people, right? It's people who people know, they come from the same town, and you're going to need maintenance. So you've got to have people locally that can come back every year and make sure things are working or whatever it needs to be. So I think it builds that trust and the local network of people that you would consider having into your home to do the work.
Work like installing an air source heat pump. So talk to me a little bit about heat pumps.
So heat pumps aren't known necessarily for being the most friendly things in the world. They're a lot of people think of them a box on the side of the house. And yet when we go on holiday to Europe or whatever, there's a lot of air conditioning units on the outside of buildings, right? But probably none of us really thought about it. So heat pumps have had a bit of a negative press in terms of what they look like and are they noisy, but they're not. But you know what I mean? So Octopus thought, you know what, we're going to take this on. And so we've invested in a company in Northern Ireland and we've actually redesigned and made our own air source heat pump. And it's cute. It's got an octopus on it. It's called the Cozy.
I'm sold.
You're sold. See, that's what I mean. So, it's a little bit of this heart and mind thing, right? Yeah. So the heat pump we've designed is going to be a high temperature, 60, 65 degrees, designed to take on the gas boiler. But a heat pump fundamentally, if you talk to an engineer, they'll say it's like a reverse fridge. Now that works on the theory that you know how a fridge works.
I have no idea.
So that doesn't work. Precisely. Okay.
Doesn't land with me.
So there's a number of analogies, but effectively it's the ability to take air, compress it really tightly, and then it generates heat, and then you release that heat out again. You can also imagine it like a warm hug, right? Somebody comes up, squeezes you really tight, you get hot, they move away again, and you then release
and that's the octopus.
Heat again.
The octopus giving you a hug.
Yeah, the octopus giving you a hug. But anyhow, so the idea is that we try and make heat pumps a much less scary proposition. That this is something that everybody has that works with the majority of homes if we can get it to the same temperature as a gas boiler.
Can I try a slightly alternative definition? I'll try and not be too engineering about it. But essentially, it's about extracting the heat from the ambient temperature. Yeah. So that's why we like water source better than air source, because water stays at a much more constant temperature. But if you've got, some water which is at, say, 15 degrees, then you can extract heat out of it and heat up to much higher temperatures through the compression system and have a slight reduction in the overall temperature of the water. But because you extract such a small amount of heat, and assuming you've got a big body of water, then it will be a unnoticeable change in the temperature within your lake or wherever you're taking that heat from. So we can take it from a lower, even though it's starting from a lower temperature, you can extract heat into a warmer temperature by going through that compression process. And that is why you can get 3 units of heat energy from 1 unit of electricity, because you are using the electricity to do the compressing, and the extra energy you're taking from the heat in the source that you're taking it from.
No, I can immediately see a comment on when we post this on social media saying, well, it won't work on my house. Because there's always this, well, it'll only work on new houses, or it'll only work on houses that have got incredible insulation. So what would be the education piece there in terms of getting people to adopt?
There are a lot of different heat networks. I think we should start with that. Sorry, heat pumps. So the most efficient heat pumps operate at much lower temperatures than gas boilers. And most of our homes have been designed to operate efficiently with gas boilers. And therefore, to enable them to operate well with heat pumps, then yes, that is necessary to do some additional works. Typically, these are the works that we should be doing anyway to minimize our heat loss. So yes, you will need to insulate your home typically before you put in a low temperature heat pump. And if you don't already have underfloor heating, then you will need to increase the size of your radiators to enable them to have a bigger surface area to operate. That is to use the most efficient low temperature heat pumps. However, you can also, as Emma was just saying, have much higher temperature heat pumps. You will have a slightly less efficient heat pump because they're heating it to much higher temperatures, but they are still considerably better than having a gas boiler from a carbon perspective, and will give you just the same level of comfort as you're accustomed to in your home. So every home can have a heat pump. The commercials are different depending on what work you do in advance to your home. So the more energy efficient you make your home, of course, the lower the ongoing costs with running, whether it's a gas boiler or a heat pump, to be honest.
Also, there is an added factor that about 80% of homes on gas have a combi boiler. And therefore, you also will need space for a tank to store the water in, which may be a consideration for some homes that they can't fit it in.
Okay.
Also, a consideration is where do you put the heat pump? So, there are restrictions on where heat pumps can go at the moment. So, that needs consideration as well. So there may physically not be a space for that heat pump to go. But as Helena said, they're designed to work with homes. You look at Denmark, Sweden, Germany, all sorts of places. Those homes have heat pumps, be it cold temperatures, warm temperatures. This technology is here, and we're trying to debunk a lot of these myths. And we're trying to show people that it can work with micro-bore pipes, for example, as our example, house in Slough. So there's a lot of things to get over in terms of, being able to show people, look, they really do work.
Going from talking about people's homes, we mentioned a few international conversations there. What is the role of the international community and what's driving this globally? People talk about things like COP and obviously COP28 last year. You were in Paris last week. Obviously, you took the train there, train back. Globally, where do we sit? What's the role of the global community in driving this forward?
From a built environment perspective, so last COP was a success in that we got the buildings breakthrough agreed at COP, which essentially says that by 2030, resilient and sustainable buildings will be the new norm, which is a great statement, but requires quite a lot of substance behind it. And so last week, in Paris was the inaugural Buildings and Climate Global Forum, which was very much around how do we take forward that commitment and implement it into policy, which enables a just transition globally, recognising, as I said in the introduction, in the UK, most of the buildings that we need in 2050, we've already got. And most of the development is going to be in developing countries with big focus across Africa and South America. And so one of the great things to have come out of last week is that we have the Charlotte Declaration, which essentially is bringing a consistent way to measuring whole life carbon across the built estate. In a way which is applicable irrespective of where you are. And actually, to go back to your comment around RICS, they're consolidating communities and all different groups to have consistent approach in how we measure and how we report the carbon, particularly in that early stages of life cycle analysis, because there is a lot of very different interpretation at the moment, which is driving really different decision-making practices. And, the great example in London is the M&S building. Should it be refurbished or should it be demolished with a new net zero building put in its place? And the public divide, the for people who've read the technical reports behind it, the conflicting advice coming out of that is all because we don't have sufficient guidance to consistently measure products and outcomes in the same way. So, a great thing to have come out of last week is the fact that going forwards we will have that. We have really strong commitment from, I think it's up to 80 countries now. Ministers have signed up to this agreement. But part of that is also around having those local materials and local solutions, much the same way as, in UK, there's great opportunity within each of the regions to drive the decarbonisation. It's the same is important for all other countries and around developing their economies and developing safe, secure and sustainable homes for their population also. So that's a huge move forwards at a global level. More locally, we have coming out later on this year, for the first ever time, the net zero carbon building standard for the UK, which again is bringing this consistent method for measurement and reporting, and also consistent targets for how buildings should be performing across different sectors. Again, looking at the whole life way of looking at buildings, and the targets get progressively harder, because what we can achieve now, there will be a lot of innovation between now and 5 years' time, and therefore our targets need to be getting harder so that we're continually being challenged to strive to improve.
Wow. So we're in 18 different countries around the world now, both supplying power or working through our Kraken database. So we have, a fairly good view of the world about trends, things that are going. The great thing is within Octopus, we're trading ideas and thoughts. Our zero bills proposition developed here is now in Europe and around the world. We're getting software packages, different companies approaching us. And also people want to work for us, right? That have come from different backgrounds, and that's really exciting too. So we are seeing that innovation, we are seeing new thinking, and it is pushing us forward. So, we're working in West Africa, trying to actually leapfrog technologies and take a community with no power to have, wind and solar backing a smart city development, So we know we've got this great team that can go and deliver. And I think, we need to be listening what other people are doing too, and really understanding. And then, dare I say, at a lower level, we need to make sure that whatever happens, in the future, that things stay sort of stable in terms of things like grants for swapping out heat pumps for gas boilers and things like that. We need to get some traction behind some of these initiatives. So with a real clear focus on 2050 and maybe not short-term kind of snap decisions, so that people can plan and really look at what they've got to do to their individuals' properties or in their life or whatever. So sort of it's a very clear pathway forward for people.
At the start of the podcast, I said that this is a topic that we could probably record a series about, and I'm now regretting that we didn't book the studio for the day and make that happen, because obviously we've not even scratched the surface, and the last 40 minutes or so have absolutely flown by. So I think it's probably a good place to end it today. We've gone through a wide range of topics, going from hopefully giving people a better definition and an understanding of what net zero actually means, going through to all the way through to what the role of the international community. So personally, I've learned a lot, and I imagine our listeners have as well. So huge thanks, Helena Rivers from AECOM. Thank you very much for joining us, and Emma Fletcher from Octopus as well. Thank you.